Wonderful, thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Cool. So yeah, symmetry theory of valence, and yeah, just kind of defining terms. So we're all on the same page. So basically there's this thing called the core affect, which is basically what you get when you apply dimensionality reduction techniques to actually many areas of psychology. Surprisingly robust kind of two dimensions that emerge. Co-occurrences of words, or even just like descriptions of behavior, and basically these two axes, basically arousal and valence, seem to account for something like 60% of the variance in terms of what information emotional words contain. And I mean, roughly speaking, arousal is kind of the level of activation, how energetic you are, and valence is how good you feel. And I mean, most of what I'm going to be talking about is about valence. That said, you need to also kind of consider arousal into the picture to kind of know what this is all about. And just a few examples, you have high arousal, high valence. So that would be kind of a, excitement and anticipation. But you also can have high energy, but not feel really good, and that would be kind of anxiety or anger, irritation. Likewise, you have depression, low arousal, low valence, and serenity, or peaceful, blissful calm. That would be low arousal, high valence. And this is just one example of one of the ways in which you can recover kind of these dimensions of valence and arousal. This was a little study we conducted years ago, which basically we were giving people, people who have experience with all kinds of substances online. We were giving them this survey where basically they were, going to describe a particular substance, basically along something like 70 different dimensions. And then I conducted factor analysis on that data set. And interestingly, we have kind of three core dimensions of valence or valence-related axes, which kind of give you a sense of, okay, what is the space of possible effects that you can get from some substances. There were actually 6 dimensions that emerged, but three of them are valence-related. And these are kind of just giving you a picture of it. So we have basically slow euphoria, which would be kind of low arousal, high valence, with top terms like calming and relieving. And the negative predictors of it would be something like anxiety producing, difficult bodily discomfort. Fast euphoria is the sort of thing you get with stimulants, energizing, sociable, the opposite of feeling spaced out and confusing. The other axis that kind of emerged was this notion of spiritual euphoria. That's the term I used back then. I also use the term significance or saliency. Nowadays, I would actually use the term criticality for other reasons that we can go into. But yeah, basically, there's this other kind of axis of how you can experience intense valence with substances, which is different than slow and fast euphoria, which would be kind of the psychedelic space. And that gets marked with things such as mystical, incredible, life-changing. And the opposite of that is trivial, self-centered, or irrelevant, or something like that. This is just to complete the cube. And in a sense, this is kind of just a change of basis, but you still get, in a sense, the valence dimension kind of emerge out of this dimensionality reduction analysis. And if you were to apply just one dimension, if you do if you find just one factor, if you ask the factor analysis to just give you one factor, is going to be the valence factor. That's kind of the part of basically the axis that accounts for most of the variance for the effects of drugs. Now, I've got to say that I absolutely acknowledge that emotions are far more complex and intricate than just valence and arousal. This is the results of my master's thesis, where basically we were analyzing this thing called mood updates, how people feel over time, day after day. And I was basically computing the transition the transition probabilities between emotions. And
you can do cluster analysis here, or like finding attractors, and you'll see that there's like, additional information. That said, we concluded that a big chunk of kind of the additional information that is not valence and arousal is actually information about your trajectory in the valence arousal space. So for example, we found these, what we called gateway emotions, like for example, feeling relieved and feeling hopeful, which basically contain information that you were in the negative kind of depressive attractor, and you're moving towards the positive high arousal attractor. So in a sense, emotions, the terms we use also give you, is not only where you are in the valence arousal space, is also basically what is your trajectory in that space. But in a sense, it's still valence and arousal. Like that still is, how you can account for a very, very big chunk of like what an emotion is. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you of the importance of valence, at least in this context. Now let's jump into the symmetry theory of valence. And I've got to say, the overall hypothesis and kind of the first argument appeared in this really, really awesome work by my collaborator Michael Johnson, Principia Qualia. He has a really, I think, like a really interesting kind of skeleton of an argument that like points to a lot of like research threads that is really worth getting into. I highly recommend digging into this work. And one of the things that it lays out is basically the kind of conceptual framework to make sense of like, okay, what type of thing valence might be. And I'll just kind of define a couple terms. Which is first Qualia formalism. That is, if there's like one thing at QRI we are like married to, you could say, it would be Qualia formalism. That is, for any conscious experience, there exists a mathematical object isomorphic to it. And we can make kind of an analogy here to something like electromagnetism, that we used to have like lightning and electricity and magnets, and all of that seemed kind of all sorts of, somehow thinly related, but like it turns out that there's actually just 4 equations of electromagnetism that ties together all of that phenomena. And you can compare it to something like, elan vital, the essence of life, that people used to think that, okay, maybe there is some kind of a substance that like determines whether you're alive or not. And we would say that, well, that kind of fell through. In the end, there's like molecular complexity under more molecular complexity. And there doesn't seem to be such a thing as like, life itself. Like life is not formalizable in the same way as electromagnetism is. But something that we would claim at QRI, or we could say something that we assume at QRI because we believe is a very generative frame, is that yes, there will be a set of like deep mathematical structure to consciousness. And in particular, if you kind of expand this into kind of other areas, we also think this is going to apply to valence, that there is going to be deep and rich mathematical structure to valence, and that is valence structuralism in this case. Now, in Principia Qualia by Mike Johnson, he has kind of this argument for it. I definitely recommend reading it, especially if you have kind of the aesthetic of a physicist. I think you'll really like this work because I think it's really, really good in that sense. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is try to kind of like give you kind of like an intuition for it, and then like the whole empirical argument. Also, by the way, if my internet is failing at any point, let me know, because I have a phone I can tether to and continue the presentation. So please let me know if I'm breaking out a lot. Okay, so importantly, there are a lot of theories of what valence is, and Mike looked at the literature, did a very deep dive into it, and realized that they're usually unsatisfactory, or at the very least, they don't get at the true core of what valence, like what an explanation for valence should be like. So basically, you have this account. So for example, hey, valence is how the brain represents value. but ultimately that's just a correlation. Value is a fuzzy abstraction. Likewise, some people think like, well, valence is the presence of opioids in the brain. But hey, if you inject opioids in different parts of the brain, it doesn't always feel good. It actually needs to be injected in a very narrow range of, stripes in the pleasure centers, and otherwise it just causes, strange feelings or wanting. But it's not kind of the signature of valence itself. Or, for example, the pleasure centers. But just because you're calling something the pleasure centers and it's correlated with feeling good, it doesn't mean you have an explanation. It's not a very insightful, illuminating, let's say, account of valence. So what could it be? And I would say, I'll focus to a large extent on like what we might call bliss, which is just very positive valence. Like, what is that? What is very positive valence? What is the sense of ecstasy, bliss, intense happiness? And I think there's a lot of these kind of intuitions. There's definitely a lot of people think it's some kind of spiritual signal, and I wouldn't want to convince you out of that. But the truth is that there are a lot of different spiritualities, and they say sometimes like contradictory things. So it's kind of strange to expect that there's, these like underlying universal kind of a spiritual signal that like, hey, whenever you're doing something aligned with spirit, you feel good, because sometimes you can do something very different than somebody else and still have that feeling. Also, like merely chemical reactions in the brain. Again, not a super satisfactory explanation. Pleasure centers, health, few prediction errors. And in the end, I add, symmetry in consciousness, which is, what I will be arguing. I also want to point out, and this is like, super important, that valence is not the same as healing, and it's not the same as meaning. However, they're correlated. And I would also go as far as to say that high valence is necessary for healing and for meaning to a large extent. That in a sense, you can have a lot of like very high valence states that are actually very unhealthy for you. Just an example would be, methamphetamine. It can feel great, but it's unsustainable. And like to the extent that, your nervous system is self-organizing around that high valence experience, it makes you kind of the center of your life. And it's a dopamine releaser. It's obviously unsustainable. You can't actually do that long term and expect good results. Whereas something like meditation or even psychedelics, because its tolerance mechanism is very, very different, you could say that those might be high valence, high meaningful, and also healing experiences. So I just want to say that high valence doesn't entail healing. And that in that sense, you might say like, okay, why are we so interested about this? But I would say that high valence is a element, is a necessary condition for deep healing. And I would even go as far to say that for a psychedelic experience to be deeply healing, it has to involve high valence in one context or another. Of course, you may end up like processing a lot of like very difficult emotions, but ideally would be something that basically allows you to heal those difficult emotions and transform them into a state of mind that is basically has many more of the positive qualities. And more so, high valence, even according to the Buddha, it's an important factor for awakening. Of the 7 factors for awakening, I would actually say about like 5 of them are like very connected to valence. Mindfulness, joy, relaxation, concentration, equanimity. They are kind of different flavors of high valence. There are different ways in which a very high valence experience can manifest. And okay, like the Buddha says, these are important things. And even if you only care about awakening, enlightenment, you may also care about, okay, what is the mathematics of valence? It might point you in the right direction as well. I'll also mention there's a big difference between the recipe of a state of consciousness and kind of what you might call the review or the description of that state of consciousness. And I make an analogy with cooking, that if you have like cooking instructions for how to make a cake, sometimes it's very counterintuitive what cake is going to taste like, like add yeast and, a lot of things that like, okay, like you may not know exactly how it's going to actually affect the result. And so like the recipe may look very different than the review of the state. So I would say for a lot of like meditation states or like even just like general life advice, this idea of, don't mindlessly chase pleasure or like try to satisfy all of your existing desires compulsively. Yeah, doing that is not going to, result in a sustainable high valence. And to some extent, kind of a lot of meditation instructions that say like, yeah, like have neither kind of an approach or a withdrawal response to emotions, kind of this equanimity. It sounds like it's a fully neutral experience, right? It sounds like it's unrelated to valence. It's almost kind of cutting out valence. But I would say that's just the recipe. That is like the instructions of how you manage your attention in order to eventually change your brain to actually generate these very healthy, sustainable, high valence states. So I definitely want to kind of overcome this prejudice of thinking that, hey, like high valence is unrelated to spirituality. Like, no, I think they're like actually very deeply, intimately connected. Okay, so let's go into the symmetry theory of valence. I'll just read these, but we will go into more depth into all of these. So, we talked about Qualia formalism. There's a mathematical object whose features are isomorphic to phenomenology. We believe that, yeah, harmony basically feels good because it's symmetry over time. And basically there's kind of this duality between symmetry in space and symmetry in time. We will go over pleasure centers. The way we explain pleasure centers in this theory is that they are kind of tuning knobs, or they're these bridges that basically, when they get activated, they enable global large-scale synchrony in the brain. And this is something that ultimately is very testable, because if you can activate the pleasure centers or inhibit, whole brain harmony, we predict that's going to actually negate the positive valence effects of the pleasure centers. And likewise, if you can induce, large-scale harmony without activating the pleasure centers, or maybe even inhibiting the pleasure centers, we expect that to be a high valence state. So it's a cool testable interpretation of what pleasure centers even are. Boredom is kind of an anti-symmetry mechanism. So like that's why, even if you look at a cathedral or something like that, you're not going to be happy forever. You're going to be happy for a little bit. Yeah, because your brain realizes that you're not learning anything and adds kind of this dissonance in order to make you, move on into something else. We are wired in such a way that, what helps us reproduce symmetrifies our consciousness. So like, it's not that, high calorie food in and of itself is symmetrical. It's not that it in and of itself is pleasant. It's more that the way our nervous system is programmed is such that when you eat high calorie food, it triggers high valence. And that triggered high valence is what would be symmetrical, not necessarily the chemicals that you're eating and so on. Yeah, I'll go on. So importantly, valence, we think, has kind of these three dimensions, which is positive, neutral, and negative. And you can actually have like highly mixed experiences. You can have experiences, I don't know, like an example is like you're at a concert, enjoying yourself, but also you have to go to the bathroom and, you just broke up with your boyfriend, whatnot. It's like, you can have these very complex mixed valence experiences where like parts of your experience are very pleasant, parts are very distressing, parts of those are very neutral. And that's fine. At the same time, it still kind of collapses into these like ultimately, hey, are you having a good time or not? And something that the symmetry theory of valence would say, and this is a pretty interesting kind of relationship, and I'll explain it in a couple slides. This is just to kind of put it out there in your head to bounce around as we go on, which is that we expect there to be a very, very intimate relationship between information content and basically the range of valence that you have access to. So in brief, very, very high valence states of consciousness, we expect those to be like very close to zero information. Whereas when you have like this, close to pure white noise, we expect that to be like basically zero valence. And hopefully this will make more sense as we go along. These are just kind of some illustrations of this principle, that like actually we expect that some of the most negative experiences out there will actually be pretty close to very, very highly symmetrical. I put this kind of like disjointed lattice at the bottom, and I would claim that something like a bad 5-MeO DMT experience is actually something like that. That is like this very regular, except for some strange disjoints or imperfections that cause profound dissonance. Whereas like, if you're in the pure noise kind of like range, it all feels blah. It all feels really close to neutral. And when we say, okay, like the state of consciousness is highly symmetrical, let's talk, let's say 5-MeO DMT or Jhanas or something like that. We expect these to actually show up in many ways. That like if you look at the biorhythms like heart rate and breathing, that's going to show up. Symmetry is going to show up in some ways that way. A different kind of projection. I mean, ultimately, the formalism, this mathematical object corresponds to consciousness is not observable directly, at least not right now. So we have to kind of like rely on these projections, these interpretations of what's going on, these ways of getting at this unobservable underlying state. And EEG, connectum harmonics, biorhythms are different ways of getting at it. And I'll show you, at least empirically, that it's all so far consistent with the symmetry theory of valence. So, okay, here's kind of the big plan. All of these different projections of this underlying state. So we have basically this stimuli. Basically these are kind of like visualizing also for to give you an example. So like there's like stimuli, basically more symmetrical stimuli leads to more higher valence. Then there's like the endogenous bodily state, biorhythms as well. The CNS state, the actual, okay, what's going on in your brain. Then the formalism, and then the phenomenology of valence. And basically, when you have high valence, basically we expect, and what we see is that there's symmetry all across the board in each of these different ways of looking at the state of consciousness. So I'll go on and start with phenomenology. Now, I know that, phenomenology is such a tricky thing. It's so difficult to do right. It's like so difficult to do, make a lot of mistakes in phenomenology, get confused, self-deceive. So, I mean, hopefully the observations I'll relate to you is going to show that, yeah, okay, like at least we're taking care of some of the, failure modes of phenomenology. So first of all, we distinguish between, intentional content and phenomenal character. So like if you smoke DMT and you experience, you say something like, well, I saw a dragon with my own eyes. It's like, that doesn't mean there was actually a mind-independent dragon out there. And, I take seriously, your report that you saw a dragon, but I don't know how significant that is necessarily. On the other hand, if you describe, oh, and by the way, the dragon had scales that had a symmetry group of what's called the glide mirror symmetry group, and it had like 17 hertz strobing effect. It's like, oh, okay, yes, we're getting more into the phenomenal character. You're actually describing what it felt like, not only what it was about. And I would basically make the claim that, these observations of symmetry being related to valence is about the phenomenal character. I don't care that much about, what was the journey, what was the content of the experience. I care more about what it felt like, what are the features of it. And what we observe is that there's a deep connection here. So I'll just give you some examples. Basically, introspect, like the difference between massage and bodily pain. Like massage is kind of like these very, very pleasant, harmonious, like tactile patterns throughout your body that basically kind of like give you these like very nice waves of pleasure, as opposed to like bodily pain. And bodily pain, if you introspect on it, it's almost kind of like there's like pinch points and discontinuities and fragmentations and deformations in your sense of self and the continuity of your skin or your felt sense of your inner organs. Basically, I would make the claim that bodily pain always manifests in one way or another as a kind of symmetry breaking operation. Now, definitely keep this in mind if you ever have a pain again. Hopefully not. Also, let's say like anxiety versus relaxation. Anxiety, you could almost describe it as constant prediction errors. It's like, oh, did my heart did something strange? Like, is my leg, positioned properly? Like, basically, it's a state of mind where like all of these little imperfections bubble up to your awareness. And that, I would say, basically is kind of like interrupting the flow of your attention and creating these like pinch points and deformations in the way you experience the world. As opposed to relaxation, where it's like you're almost kind of just completely melted into it, and like it's so basically so regular, you can almost filter out most of your bodily sensations. And in that sense, yeah, I would argue it's has a very symmetrical quality. There's also, this whole argument Mike brings up, which is the phenomenology concerning non-adaptedness, the non-adaptedness principle, which is that basically there's a bunch of things out there that feel really good, but that weren't in our evolutionary environment. And those are hints. We consider those hints that like, hey, if something wasn't in the African savanna but feels great, it probably means that it's kind of directly hacking into the patterns of valence somehow. We didn't evolve to filter those out or not get absorbed by them. And yeah, here are some examples, but I'll go deeper into those. Now, there's also these exotic valence, bodily pain, anxiety, relaxations. That's kind of like, you could say like normal valence is like valence that we're all used to. But I would say that also in strange valences, like valences in weird states of consciousness, they also basically follow this pattern that in some sense symmetry explains their pleasantness. And I'll give you some examples. So dream music. So I've had the pleasure or displeasure, you could say, of having had a lot of sleep paralysis. Also like lucid dreams. You could also experience this on lucid dreams. But basically, if you've had a lucid dream where you were like making music or you hallucinated that there was like a radio playing, you will notice that like, oh my gosh, like the music can be beautiful, like incredible. And like it's music, maybe you have heard before, maybe not, maybe your brain is generating on the fly, but it has a quality to it that is extraordinarily, hedonic and pleasant. And I remember like basically studying this on myself, like over like many lucid dreaming experiences, that like at first I thought like, oh my gosh, my brain is just unlocking this ability to create awesome harmonies and melodies. But then I ended up realizing that even if I just make a kind of an kind of this like meditation sound, even if that sound is extremely simple, the quality of the sound in the lucid dream is profound. I mean, it's almost kind of a surround sound, like 360 surround sound, and stereoscopic and full of reverb and richness. And I would claim that it's actually, because during a kind of like a dream state, your brain is more resonant. You can kind of enter into these like very, very resonant attractors. And it's that quality that is what basically makes the music so compelling, not the melody. And, actually, if you transcribe the melody may not be very significant. It was how it sounded like that was like so profound in the music, in the dream. Then you have like, meditation, like even these images, maybe, I don't know if this is cheating, but, like representations of meditation, like high attainments and so on, they usually come with these beautiful symmetries and whatnot. But no, I mean, like if you examine the phenomenology of, Jhanas as how they're described, there seems to be kind of this projection of like less and less information content in your experience, going from having all of your attention concentrated in one point to then like, the experience of completely perfectly smooth, boundless space to then just, pure consciousness. And then like, the experience of neither nothing nor something. In a sense, like that's kind of like approaching the limit of zero information. And then people report that, these jhana experiences, they're not pleasant in a conventional sense. It's not like, eating ice cream or something like that, but like they're still very, very high valence. They're blissful in an exotic way. But I do want to point out that there's this fascinating, strange relationship here between low information content and kind of the blissfulness and the healing quality of the state. And then there's psychedelics. I mean, again, I don't want you to focus on the intentional content, like what was the experience about, what you thought, which of course can influence your valence, but it's more about the phenomenal character that there's this phenomena of tracers. You move your hand around and you see kind of like copies laying around, and in a sense is giving a temporal depth to your experience. It's almost kind of adding a new dimension of time where basically qualia can pile up. And usually if the trip is good, you'll notice that basically these tracers are basically in harmonic relationship with each other. And that is kind of the essence of what makes them feel so good. Likewise, there's psychedelic texture repetition. You stare at a piece of grass on LSD and it starts to symmetrify. And I would totally say this is exotic valence, because you ask the person and they will say, the ground was symmetrifying. And I don't know why, but it was awesome. There was something really cool about it. And why would that be? It's, and I would say and from my interpretation here, our interpretation, psychedelics are in a sense unlocking the valence capacity of your visual cortex. It's kind of transforming your cortex into a pleasure machine. Basically, it's allowing it to exhibit these profound symmetries. And that is what actually is making them feel so compelling. People will struggle to explain why were the visuals cool? Why were they interesting? And when it comes down to it, I think it is the symmetry. Interestingly, any of what these are called the wallpaper symmetry groups. There's 17 possible ways of tessellating a two-dimensional space. From subjective reports, we know that any of these can be experienced on a psychedelic. The ground kind of chaotically will arrive at one attractor of symmetry. It could be any of these 17. And they all feel great. They're all extremely aesthetic and beautiful and blissful in one way or another. But it's kind of a testament to just how general this effect is. More so, I would make the claim, this is obviously a strong claim, but it matters for something like, therapy, psychedelic therapy. We recently saw, this fascinating research on psilocybin for major depression and so on, that, and that a lot of these effects are mediated by whether you had a mystical experience or not. And I would basically say that if you did have a mystical experience and it was healing, I would bet that while you were having that experience, the sense of space and time was basically extremely, extremely symmetrical. And, here's kind of this is why it's so confusing, because you come back and you say, well, I saw Jesus, and you think that you got healed because Jesus. I mean, I don't want to dissuade you from that view, but I would basically ask you okay, but when you experienced Jesus, what was the feeling of the space and time? And they might say something like, oh, it had a beautiful light. It had this beautiful harmony and rainbows. And I'll claim that if you introspect on that, it's actually the quality of space and time that is healing and blissful. And, the meaning, the religious meaning, is something that is helping your mind basically concentrate on that space and taking it seriously as a way of kind of propagating this negentropy in your nervous system. Now, another place where this shows up super, super clearly, I would say phenomenologically, is on DMT. And I definitely recommend this article we wrote, basically charts the DMT space. And there's basically, you can know a lot about where you are in the DMT space by basically describing what is your energy level on the one hand, and then what is the information content on the other. And I would say, DMT states that have close to zero information content would be kind of these geometric, perfectly repeating, symmetry groups, either 2D or 3D, whereas, more chaotic states would be kind of in the middle. And basically the energy level would be it's a matter of dose. Basically kind of the height is very, very dose dependent. But then the valence, I think it's very, very dependent on actually where in the information content you find yourself in. And here again, there's kind of this diagram that basically the most blissful experiences you may have on DMT are going to be on these kind of honeycombs and perfectly symmetrical patterns. And the most unpleasant experiences are going to be just right next to those, are going to be kind of dissonant honeycombs. Whereas, when you get to kind of the narrative and like, machine elves and all of that stuff, that would be like very mixed. There's like both dissonance, consonance, symmetry, anti-symmetry. It's a very complex experience. Now, yeah, and like, the information content, we think of them as basically attractors in feedback systems that like you may end up in a chaotic attractor, you may end up in a limit cycle or a fixed point, and that will determine like, how much information content the state has. Interestingly, this also can be used to basically describe the difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. That basically we think, DMT tends to have a lot more information content. So you have like these very rich patterns, and actually I would say competing synchronies. Like on DMT, there's like all of these slightly different frequencies that are competing for your attention and creating a narrative out of that. And that is like a very mixed experience. It's both blissful and distressing at the same time. Whereas 5-MeO DMT, which is described as like far more powerful emotionally, basically tends to give you this sense of pure space, like the feeling of, the insight into emptiness, the feeling of infinite, boundless consciousness, very, very little information content, and yet it's so emotionally impactful to such an extreme extent. And interestingly, I would say, the reports do come out that, on 5-MeO DMT, you may experience you may have like the best experience of your time, or you may have the worst experience of your life. Like it's kind of like bimodal. Like it's either amazing or it's extremely bad. Often it starts out really bad and then it gets amazing. We would describe that in terms of kind of this annealing process, where basically it starts out with dissonance. Basically, over time things like synchronize, and you do end up in this kind of all of your nervous system is entrained to the same frequency. And that feels very, very blissful. Whereas DMT is always kind of in this like mixed state. It's very difficult for DMT to be pure negative or pure positive. It's always like this mixed state. So I would say, yeah, this is kind of like the phenomenological. And I guess I'm two-thirds of the way through the presentation. So then I'm just gonna kind of like, walk you through like empirical evidence. So we were talking about phenomenology. That's one of the projections of this formalism and its symmetry. That like, hey, if there's symmetry in the formalism, it's going to manifest in some forms of phenomenological symmetry. And likewise, if you use external stimuli in order to generate a state, like let's say watching a movie, playing music, playing stroboscopic stimulation, there's like a lot of evidence that basically indicates that the symmetry of the stimuli is basically the leading factor for how pleasant or unpleasant the resulting state is. We have, kind of like all of this research in vision. And this is just some examples. Like it's so stunning, right? Because like even if you know the effect, you still get the valence response. You go to the cathedral, is like okay, I'm not gonna get high valence. I'm not gonna get high valence. You still get the response. It's pretty automatic. You have this. As long as it has like this rich, deep symmetry, oftentimes, it's going to be very beautiful. There's something very compelling about this. Just some random pictures to kind of give you a sense of this. It's like, okay, like why does this feel good? It really has very little to do with our ancestral environment. Anyway, this is like such a robust effect that, with the symmetry of faces, for example, even face paint can be used to modify the valence. So like if you don't have a perfectly symmetrical face, but you add, symmetrical face paint with like beautiful patterns, you're going to be judged as more beautiful. It's just such a strong effect that it can actually modify your perception of how beautiful somebody is. And likewise, if you add like asymmetrical patterns, you look less beautiful. Now, I wouldn't say this is like that strong evidence, because this actually does have like an evolutionary reason, like symmetry in faces is a marker of mutational load. So I don't put that much stock in, symmetry of faces being that relevant, but, symmetry in other forms is where like, I think it's so stunning. But then you also come to basically symmetry in audio, basically regular rhythms and harmony is basically the leading predictor for whether a sound is going to be pleasant or unpleasant. There's this Helmholtz Big Idea, which he was the first one to figure out like why playing two notes in a piano that are one semitone apart like feels like unpleasant, and it's because the harmonics are basically within what's called the critical window, generates beat patterns, and the beat patterns we can describe them as basically symmetry breaking operations in the waveform. Excuse me a second. And those symmetry breaking operations, in a sense, cause irritation. So basically, the more beating there is in sound, and the more beating across the spectrum, the more irritating and distracting and rough the sound is going to sound like. Whereas when you have like these harmonic relationships, you play like one note, one piano note, and another at an octave of difference, basically the harmonics line up perfectly. And actually the sound is very compressible because you don't have this extra information of like where all the other harmonics lie. It's just a harmonic sequence. And that is universally, described as like a more pleasant sound. And yeah, when you add up all the harmonics, you get kind of these interesting curves. The height here is the amount of dissonance. So basically when you have like a relationship of 1 to 2, basically an octave, you have like 0 dissonance, and like that feels really good. Now, music is very complicated, and like we have to factor in the boredom mechanism, that you get bored with like, if you just play the same octave over and over, you get bored, and that becomes kind of there's an inner sense of restlessness and dissonance. But if you just hear it for the first time, that's a super, super strong relationship. These are, just examples of a piano chord. Dissonant sounds. I guess I did have, I can send you a link to all of these sounds after the presentation, but basically I have some links in for a SoundCloud account, where you can kind of get convinced that like, oh gosh, these are actually really, really bad sounds. It's not it's not that I'm saying they're bad. Like if you ask 100 persons, like 99% of people will say they're awful. And likewise, reverb basically symmetrifies any waveform, and reverb is like almost kind of this hack that like you take almost any dissonant sound and you add reverb to it, it's going to sound a lot less bad, a lot less distracting, irritating, and so on. So this is kind of comparing the sound of a baby crying, which, by the way, like in our analysis, it shows that, babies crying, it's almost like their sound is optimized for dissonance. Like it's almost kind of like as dissonant as it gets, for good evolutionary reasons. It has to be distracting and, catch your attention, bring the desire to stop it. But you add reverb, and like to give you a sense, that's like if the baby was in a huge cave and you get kind of all these echoes averaging out to the beat patterns, it sounds way better, way less distracting. Probably not good for from an evolutionary standpoint, but it's just a fascinating kind of a transformation you can apply to any waveform. And here, just want to kind of like illustrate that valence can happen across the spectrum. So I also have this file, and you're welcome to listen to it after the presentation, where you can have basically consonants anywhere in the spectrum mixed in with dissonance anywhere in the spectrum, mixed in with noise anywhere in the spectrum. And that ends up basically creating like these very mixed states. So basically when I say like, oh, I had like a mixed valence experience, that under constraints, right? Like we don't know if the positive part was in the high frequencies or in the low frequencies. We don't know that. And that's why, kind of the full picture of valence would also include basically the spectrum for positive, negative, and neutral valence. Like you can have like high frequency pleasure, you can have low frequency pleasure, etc. So that kind of explains like why there's a tremendous diversity of possible mixed experiences, even though ultimately they still come down to symmetry. Deep down, they can all still be explained with symmetry. Now, endogenously generated symmetry, this is fascinating research that basically when you have kind of these biorhythm coherence, and there's a way of computing biorhythm coherence, very related with musical consonance, where basically, like an association between like regular, breathing and trained with heart rate variability, basically is reported as just like much better positive mood, and it's one of the things that long-term meditation achieves. That meditation entrains these biorhythms and basically makes them interlock with one another, and that is reported as giving rise to positive mood, which is kind of an interesting finding and very consistent with STV. Here are just some quotes. Cool. And I mean, like, the heart palpitations, I mean, it's similar to kind of anxiety that, if you have like this usually regular metronome and it's failing, it's like generating these imperfections. That gives rise to like unpleasant states of mind. And the large, I'm sure like heart disease is like terrible for your valence. And likewise, meditation is a wonderful tool for heart disease because it allows you to basically overcome those imperfections and still feel good despite the problem. In terms of other endogenously generated symmetry, like I would say orgasm and flow. Like orgasm, it's powerful generator of endogenous resonance. It's the entrainment of motor systems to neural hallucinations, to synchronizing feedback processes across multiple functional networks. I mean, basically an orgasm, there's a deep level of synchrony and symmetry across the nervous system. I highly recommend introspecting on this, not to get into your sex life or anything, but no, I mean, it's something you can actually pay attention to, and like it becomes very obvious. And likewise, like flow, I mean, like there's this evidence of like, basically symmetry is deeply related to flow. Two physiological metrics for measuring flow are corticomuscular coherence, and also degree of coupling between neural EEG waves and EMG oscillations of muscle activity. So there's also these kind of like interlocking patterns, lower information content, more symmetry, that, it's a strong predictor of flow. So like, hey, go figure, flow is also symmetrical. Okay, let's get into symmetry in the brain. So this is kind of another projection. Like, okay, if you look at the central nervous system, like of high valence states, how does that show up? And, meditation, like all over the place, like basically pretty much any kind of meditation, if done for a long enough time, leads to some kind of EEG coherence, like whether it's gamma coherence or delta coherence or alpha coherence, which might depend from one meditation to another. They all generate that. And coherence in EEG is intimately related with symmetry. I mean, basically, two signals are coherent basically when they're both reflections of a shared signal through a reverb pattern, meaning that they're encoding the same information just through a different filter. Again, like deeply connected to symmetry. A fascinating study from 2019 I recommend seeing, which to me was really stunning just how clear the connection with the symmetry theory of valence was this study of first and second Jhanas, and basically the interesting patterns that emerge in them. And one of them is this like seizure-like activity. Now, seizure-like activity is usually in the 3 to 5 hertz, and it doesn't have harmonic structure. I mean, the seizure doesn't have like it doesn't have its harmonics together with it. But the type of seizure-like activity you see on Jhanas does have harmonic structure, and like the picture I'm showing here is basically the Fourier transform of the independent components. But you can see there's like a very clean 5.6 hertz together with this harmonic of like 11.23 hertz. And I mean, this is kind of stunning. Like, why would this happen? And the self-report is like, this is a marker of feeling really blissful. And like, again, without the symmetry theory of valence, this is like just super surprising and strange. With the symmetry theory of valence, it's like, oh yeah, actually you're hitting a really great symmetrical attractor of your brain and sustaining it. So that's gonna feel good. Even ketamine showing high levels of gamma coherence. 5-MeO DMT, the only data set I'm aware of EEG and 5-MeO DMT shows coherence across the spectrum, not only gamma coherence, but also beta coherence and especially delta coherence. Again, why on earth? Like the symmetry theory of valence would explain this, would say like, yes, this is expected. Other theories might struggle a bit. Now, I've got to say that just because you have high coherence doesn't mean it's going to be high valence. We expect also very, very negative valence could also be high coherence, except that when you have total coherence, then we expect that to be always positive valence. Again, it's kind of that relationship, because you could still have like a high average coherence, but basically have kind of a half of your channels coherent in certain frequency and half of the other channels coherent in a slightly different frequency. That might actually maximize dissonance, so just average coherence is not enough. You also need to kind of like tell whether it's in harmonic structure or not. And yeah, I mean, basically, the pleasure in the brain seems to be kind of this distributed effect. So there's that also, from our point of view, would mean like, it's actually a whole brain phenomena. And yeah, this is about what I was mentioning about the pleasure centers, that from our point of view, I mean, there's like this like research of like, okay, if you try to synchronize clocks, you try to synchronize neurons, and you put them in a geometric grid, and it's like, if it's large enough, you're not going to usually get like full scale synchrony. Basically, you might have kind of these patches of synchrony or like traveling waves of synchrony. But if you add also kind of these random connections across the network and reducing the synaptic path length, then you can achieve the entire network to enter in synchrony. So basically, we think of the pleasure centers as kind of these bridges that are like, in a sense, like lowering the average synaptic path length across your brain, and therefore enabling synchrony across the brain. And that's what we think. We think why the pleasure centers basically feel good when you activate them. Okay, I'm getting to the end of the presentation. So I'll just like talk about like a few near enemies. I put enemies in quote because we actually, we admire these people. They're part of our research lineages. And like, I think like they're a very, very key component of like any good theory of consciousness. But I think like when it comes to valence itself, there's some explanations in this space are like really close to the symmetry theory of valence, but they're not exactly what we're getting at. So there's like this whole account of like computational efficiency. Hey, like the brain likes computational efficiency, but in a sense, you still have to explain like what they're like. If you say like, okay, the brain likes computational efficiency, like what does this liking manifests as? Basically, we use this argument of like passing the bucket, that like ideally your theory of valence should explain what valence itself is, not only when it gets triggered. And these theories of computational efficiency, energy efficiency, we would claim, they're telling you like, okay, under what conditions positive valence gets triggered, but it doesn't tell you what positive valence itself is. And that's what the symmetry theory of valence is getting at. So yeah, these are some of the issues with those, at least as complete theories. Finally, okay, like counterexamples. Basically, yeah. There's interestingly, like a lot of, there's this whole theory I recommend reading, neural annealing, Googling it or clicking on the link when I share the presentation. But basically, even like very neutral energy that is like neither has like harmony or dissonance can still give rise to very positive feelings, basically because it can give rise to this annealing process. And that's actually what we believe is going on with psychedelics, that like psychedelics gives you what Mike would call semantically neutral energy. And that gives rise to basically this entropic disintegration, a term from Robin Carhart-Harris, the entropic brain hypothesis, which then gives rise to kind of this search or self-reorganization that basically will settle on these, basins of symmetry. And it's those that feel good. It's not the energy that feels good, it's the end result, the attractor that it takes you to. And this explains, I think, like, why even somebody likes hot sauce. Hot sauce is kind of this unpleasant stimuli, but it can lead to euphoria. It can lead to this heightened state of energy. And if you introspect under euphoria of hot sauce, is not the unpleasant pain in the mouth. It's actually that it raises all of your energy, your entire amount of the intensity of your consciousness, and you can then notice these resonant waves. And it's those resonant waves that feel good. It's not the hot sauce itself. So there's kind of like a step that basically separates one from the other. And then, yeah, I'll just very briefly describe like one way we're trying to test symmetry theory of valence. Is not the only way to test it. I would even argue that, the argument I have presented is itself kind of a potentially strong argument, but like ideally, we generate novel predictions. And this is one of them, which is that we basically expect that very positive states of consciousness will have like a harmonic relationship, basically a consonant relationships between the brain harmonics, the work of Stalinatasoi. And yeah, basically this kind of algorithm of like quantifying the amount of consonants in brain harmonics, which is something we're working with, and like hopefully we'll get results soon. But yeah, basically we anticipate that, and again, like if this is true, the symmetry theory of valence would be validated. If it's not, I think like it doesn't invalidate it, because there's many ways in which it can manifest. But basically, when you have like harmonics that are in a consonant relationship with each other, and those are the main drivers of your experience, we expect that to be basically pleasant, like, euphoric. Whereas like when you have harmonics that are dissonant with each other, they generate these intense beating patterns. So we expect that to be like unpleasant, be described as unpleasant. Again, we don't know, but like we want to check if this is true. Yeah, just a couple testable predictions based on this, which is that we expect psychedelics to enhance the range of valence. Basically, psychedelics enhance energy across the board, just all of the harmonics have like more energy. We expect that basically some of those combinations will be just very consonant and reported to be very pleasant. Some of those will be very dissonant, reported to be unpleasant. Then SSRIs, there's a lot of research on SSRIs. They kind of are blunting effects. They cut the extremes of valence. So we expect when it comes to harmonics that like the SSRIs will basically be more noise, less consonance, less dissonance. MDMA, we expect it to be basically kind of a stable attractor of a few resonant modes that are like very consonant with each other. Stimulants would be kind of high frequency consonant. Opioids would be low frequency consonants. Again, this idea that like, hey, you can be in a good state, but that underdetermines whether, the symmetries in the high frequencies, the low frequencies, and, these would disentangle them. And yeah, just kind of these are the last 2 or 3 slides, I believe, which is like, yeah, the kind of a case study, which is like, yeah, SSRIs, roughly speaking, we interpret them as being like noise inducers, which is why things like, orgasm is less intense. Crying is hard. I mean, crying itself is a kind of like dissonant and sometimes consonant kind of resonant state. You feel like kind of like spaced out, and music enjoyment goes down. So yeah, we think of SSRIs are almost kind of like listening to a white noise machine along your life. So it's going to cut off the extremes. It's going to blunt both like very positive, very negative. And it's kind of like center you in the neutral valence. Whereas like psychedelics, they basically kind of purify, intensify your harmonics. And in that sense, you get to have like more pleasant and more unpleasant states on both extremes. Just to remind you, yeah, I mean, like, again, introspect. I compel you to, next time you're in a psychedelic, having a mystical experience, introspect on the quality of space and time. Of basically I suggest that you will probably be experiencing these kind of like beautiful ripples that are like in harmonic relationship to each other. Please email me if this is true or not true, but that's basically the experience so far, and I think that's the reason why this can feel so amazing. The future of mental health, basically, ideally would be that we can identify, okay, what are the sources of dissonance in your nervous system, and then basically find the shortest path to like the smallest change possible that will give rise to sustainable consonance in your nervous system. Whether this is going to be with meditation or a psychedelic session or yoga, or biofeedback. There's probably like a shortest path from a highly dissonant, dysfunctional state to a sustainable consonant state. And with that, yeah, I just want to say, thank you to other people in the team of QRI, and thank you, Robin and Shamil, and all of you guys for for attending these. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, that was remarkable, truly remarkable. Yeah, that was. I'm a bit blown away, Andrés. Yeah, one of those talks, and some of you will know what I mean. One of those talks. Yeah,